Well, we had a lot of discussion, feedback from individuals who were saying that we need to address the issue of blended families. Blended families impacts so many Americans and so many people inside the faith. Whether you're coming from a situation where a spouse has died and you've remarried because of that, or divorce and remarriage, whatever the case may be, what we recognize is that inside of the assemblies there are delicate situations where people are bringing families together. And it's a difficult situation. It can sometimes be frustrating. And so we thought it would be good to open up dialogue about that. Each one of us on the stage here has experience in the situation of a blended family, and so we'd like to just shed some light on a few concepts here. And so we're going to start with one of the common complaints that we've heard, and I've personally even experienced, and that is inequality among siblings inside of a blended family. And I know that Hector has some experience in that, so we'd like for Hector to just share with us a little bit about his experience.
Sure, thank you, Keith, and welcome everyone to this presentation of blended families. How many of you here would say that you are a blended family? There's quite a few. I believe the stats are around 65% families in the U.S. are about blended families. I'd like to give you just a short testimony about my blendedness. My parents divorced when I was young. Our dad moved up here to the U.S. and married another woman from here. And so it was interesting to have my mother down in Mexico, who we lived with, and then I moved up here. The first year was extremely rough, particularly for me because I moved, there was 14 of us, and I was the first one that moved up here to the U.S. I was around 10 or 11. And so my stepmom had one son. He was younger than me. And of course, he was her pride and joy. And all of a sudden, you've got another kid that's a little bit older and somebody that her husband is very fond of, because I'm not going to say I was his favorite, but I would say that we had a good relationship. I've always loved and respected my dad, as we all did, my brothers and sisters. So you can imagine, here I am in America, a 10-year-old kid, not only having to navigate through the culture, but also the language. And all of a sudden, I found myself a victim of child abuse from my stepmom. She was extremely, shall we say, rugged with me. She would not spank, but beat me for many things. If I forgot the soap to take to the laundry, she would pull over and I would get whooped. If I complained about playing with my younger son, she would throw things at me. The abuse went on for about a year. I was understandably shocked, had never experienced anything like that. She understandably was frustrated. She did not expect that type of life change. All of a sudden, you've got the perfect life. You've got your husband, you've got your son, and you have yourself. And all of a sudden, you got this other life, the son that comes from Mexico and completely different culture. So for a year, it was extremely rough. Talking about the quality of discipline, there wasn't any. I got all the discipline. I felt like my brother, our young brother, didn't get any discipline. And I was extremely upset, obviously. And I would rebel at times. But I had to be careful how I rebelled because I knew I would get a whooping. So having the experience of being abused as a child is a blessing for me, because it taught me as an adult and as a father to be cautious about how I treated my son. Now, there is a story, there's a good story to this, because I don't want to just give you the negativity about it. And I also want to explain a little bit about why it's so important for blended families to consider how you discipline the child that is not yours. And there's a lot of issues for me, in counseling families. I was a counselor, a juvenile and family counselor for about 13 years. And counseling families that are blended, the biggest issue that I ever encountered was not finances. It wasn't other things. It was always, how do you navigate through that family by treating and disciplining somebody else's children? The mother would say, well, he or she's my child, you can't do that. The child would say, you can't tell me that because you're not my dad, right? That's that inequality, the unfairness. And so there's a lot of issues that come along with attempting to discipline children. If you are in a blended family and if you abuse your child, just remember that he's going to grow up. You're going to get older and he's going to grow up. He could turn out to be a monster and treat you very, very bad. And that's one of the things that I had as a child when I was within that abusive year. I don't remember a time when I did not get hit. Each and every day for, I believe, 365 days, from June when I came here until the next June when I went back to Mexico, I was hit every day, and it started off right away. So as a blended family, that's one of the most challenging things you're going to be dealing with, and you are dealing with. I know you are. If you have a blended family, you're dealing with how do you discipline the children in the family. And the biggest thing that I can tell you is you're going to have to really focus and work hard at looking at the mission. What is the mission of your family? What is the purpose of getting together? Is it so that you can be together, or is it so that you can be together as a family with children? Understanding you're adopting children coming in, because that's also a blended family, right, Amy? Adopted families are also blended families. And you have to have that mission. You have to have that statement of family, and you have to have that purpose, and you have to understand there has to be unity, equality, and fairness in everything you do. And you've got to get out those emotional feelings away from you and look at the goodness of what it is to raise your children as a family. Now, for a year, I couldn't tell my dad because I felt, for one thing, it's because my stepmom would say, if you tell your dad, I'm going to beat you even more. And I believed it. And so it wasn't until I went back to Mexico that I got the nerve to tell my grandmother. And then my grandmother raised Cain. And I mean, she raised Cain. You guys remember Cain and Abel? Well, I saw Cain. He arose. He was standing right there because she was extremely angry. And so she dealt with it, and the moral of the story is today, my stepmom and I are extremely close. I love her with all my heart. I don't hold anything against her. It was tough for her. It was tough for me. As a matter of fact, I'm closer to her now than I am with my own real mother, who's still in Mexico. She's got nothing but love for me, for us. I have nothing but respect for her. It was a tough year. It was bad. But through it all, we learned to forgive each other. I go down there. She treats me like a king. You know, you guys have families. You guys have your own real mothers who come. You guys come home and she cooks whatever you want. That's my stepmom. So it's not a bad story. It's actually a good story. But you have to have that forgiveness. You got to have that purpose. Once she understood that we were going to be a blended family for life, she mellowed out. And she learned to love us. And then the following year, we had 8 kids come along, all of us blended. And you can imagine the shock. So, yeah, we had some adjustment of years. But listen, you can get past it. You can be successful. And you can have a relationship that's as close or almost as close, if not closer, than your real parent. Your real parents will never be replaced. They'll never be replaced. So I'm not trying to say anything negative. All I'm telling you is that you can get past the difficult times, have a purpose, be fair, and look at have that vision of where you want to go, and your families will be successful. There you go. That's my story. That's my testimony.
Thank you, Hector. Before you pass it, I just wanted to sort of open maybe a conversation. In your experience, which we appreciate all the experience you had in family counseling, what are some, in my family, I know that my stepdad, I know he wanted to discipline me, but my mom was probably telling him, keep your hands off my baby.
Sure. Absolutely.
And I was a good boy. But no, seriously, young people need to have boundaries and they need to be trained. And so
Sure.
I remember, my stepdad would just sort of, he'd lecture me forever. And, but how can, for a dad, maybe in a situation where a stepdad who's wanting to have some authority in the home, especially when you're in our kind of a circle and we recognize the place of a father in the home, how can mom and dad work together to allow the stepdad to have the authority within reason, obviously, not overstepping his bounds? Do you have any advice there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just, speaking from experience, I will tell you this, that once my dad knew, he took charge, he took control. He took away he helped out a lot with the stress that she was under. He understood it. He had compassion for it. He helped her through it. He became firm, but yet fair. And so he began to sort of help her through the process because, again, she was emotionally stressed because here, she felt like I was going to be taking away the love that she had from my dad, and then also the love that she had for her son. And so once she was able to see that wasn't going to happen, it helped out a lot. But I think the biggest thing is communicating and understanding and having that purpose. And sometimes you have to just keep quiet when you know that the discipline is just. Now, if you're a mother or if you're a father and you know that your child did something wrong, they need to be disciplined. Now, I'm not saying you take, a whip and you whip them 100 times, 20 lashes or 40 lashes, whatever it is. But what I'm saying is that if your husband sees your son do something, right, and what he did, or she did something wrong, and they decide to put him on a timeout, support them in that, right? Listen, parents know, and these are not blended families, but I know because I have the experience of both. So parents know that children will always try to split you up. It doesn't matter whether you're stepfather, step-parent or not. They're going to try to split you up. So if you work together and decide that the discipline is just and appropriate and sort of hold your tongue and not say anything, because the minute you say, well, that's my child, then you're not really a family then. You're really not. You can be together and you can live together, but the minute you say, that's my child and you can't touch my child, you can't discipline my child, then you're not a family. And I think that's what happens. Those children know, well, I'll do something wrong and I know my mom's going to protect me. She's going to enable me, rather. They don't know it in those terms, but that's basically what happens. You're being enabled to misbehave. And the other thing is respect. Listen, it's not just you have to respect everyone, because you do. Children need to learn respect. And so they need to learn to respect every adult, whether they're family, friends, and especially your parents. Your stepdad, your stepmom, you still have to learn to respect them. Children will say it all the time. You're not my mother. You're not my father. You can't tell me what to do. And those are the times when you have to step up and say, well, you know what? It's because of respect. That's what trumps everything. You're going to do what that adult says. Because if you don't teach them to respect, they're not going to listen to your step-parents, and they're not going to listen to their parents or anybody else that's outside of their life circle, their family circle. So I think basically discussion, understanding, and not taking things personal is important. You have a question back there? I don't know if you want to entertain it.
Yeah, just one second. Because I was thinking about what you were saying there. I was, it seemed like in my stepdad, because he was limited on how he could discipline me, sometimes I would find him on my side. But then other times he'd be on mom's side, which made him a traitor. And so I feel like because he wasn't allowed the same authority that she was allowed, he became just a friend, And I think that's okay, and now we are friends and whatnot, but I just never could view him as a real authority in my life because she limited him. So what was the question that we had over here?
When I was married, I had 2 daughters. The oldest was used to coming in the middle of the night, if she had wet the bed, coming to get mom. And I would, if I didn't have clean sheets, I would put clean towels down, whatever. My husband and I had only been married for maybe 2 weeks. She came in the middle of the night, woke me up, and was used to my getting clean pajamas. He reached over and he said, "You get back into the mess right now." And at that point, I said, "Excuse me?" And I got up and did what I normally did. Instead of dealing with it and talking about it with him for a few minutes, of course, it was the middle of the night. My daughter then knew, no problem. My mom is the one I'm going to go to. Instead of dealing with it and letting him get the respect he should have gotten had I dealt with it and talked it over with him the next day, from then on, and it's no wonder there were problems after that, I didn't know how to let him be a father. He had never been a father. So he thought he knew all there was about raising kids. I don't know why I told that, but I feel like it just needed to be said. When a mom takes over and doesn't let the father or the new parent be who they should be.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's, I think that's a great example. I think once children figure out, the limitations of a step parent, then, or in some situations it could be even the exact opposite. Maybe they feel like the step parent's the one that gives them what they want all the time, and so they sort of form an union against the blood relative there. Does anyone else have a comment or? Sure.
Can you clarify one quick statement I made real quick? Regarding the abuse that I received for about a year, I said that I saw it as a blessing. I don't see abuse as a blessing. I just want to clarify that. What I see is the fact that I was able to get past it. And the other thing that I appreciate now as an adult, especially when I was counseling those families and the children, the youth, is the fact that I have compassion, I have understanding. I can relate to them. I don't tell them my story, but I know where they are. And that makes a huge difference. So when I talk to them about how to get past that, like, here's how you're going to get over the hill, I've been there, and I know. And so I don't want everybody to think, oh, yeah, he believes that getting abused for a year is a blessing, is a good thing. No, what I'm talking about is the experience, the knowledge that I was able to take. And so then at some point, Yahweh put me in a place where I was able to help people and to assist them and to go through that border. I don't do that anymore because now I work for parole and I'm a supervisor there. So my job is completely different. I'm still helping people, and some of those guys are still calling me. It's interesting. I go to facilities that I work with to monitor what the offenders are doing, and those guys will recognize me. And they'll come up. A lot of them would call me dad. And so like, there's my dad. I haven't seen him in years. And they would come up and, some really good relation. But I think it's because of that and getting past it. No child deserves to be abused. So don't try what I just told you at home, right? It doesn't always go well that way. Sometimes it's those children that I would counsel that were abused and they ended up in prison and they're going to be there for life. So, again, I just wanted to clarify that, make sure that.
Thank you. I think the clarification was only 365 days of abuse, right? Okay. No, thanks for clarifying that. I think it's a good point, and we don't want to send the wrong message here. So, James, I know that you have a different experience. You sort of experienced a blended family, but from the outside, looking in. Can you tell us about that?
Right. And I actually have a little bit of experience of this from both sides, but mainly my wife grew up in a blended family. She was raised by her grandmother, and I know that is a very common thing that's going on these days. Grandparents raising children, and whenever she was born, she was adopted by her grandmother and grandfather, raised alongside her teenage sister, and didn't know for many years that this was her mother that she was living with instead of her sister. Never met her real father. And because of that type of scenario where she was raised by a much older woman who had maybe a different perception of how she was supposed to be raised, especially whenever you're dealing with older people that maybe have a shorter fuse, exactly. She experienced some very harsh punishment there as well. They didn't have the patience to deal with a young child again, and so there was some difficulty there. But it also led to a situation where she wasn't connected with her parental heritage. There was a disconnect, never knowing her father, finding out later that this person that she was raised with as a sister was actually her mother, and that the father was totally absent. And then even the situation dealing with many years later, you go to the doctor and they want to know your medical history and what all your parents. I know many people that are adopted are facing the same situation where there is a disconnect with your heritage that people always wonder about. And every time you go to a new doctor and you have to fill out these forms, it's actually reinforced in your mind that there's this thing that's absent from your history that you just don't know about. And so I've seen that effect watching from the outside as a spouse and how my wife deals with that. And we were actually friends in high school, and so I experienced it with her as a good friend of hers in high school where she was dealing with this, but then I've seen it continually throughout the years. And then after I was an adult, my mother remarried into another family, and you've got all of these new siblings coming in as adults, and I went to high school with one of them when we were good friends, but then there's a whole other side of the family that you're like, wow, I wouldn't choose you for a brother, you know? Yes, they are. Yeah.
We contacted those people and had them tune in. Hi. I think that's a really unique situation, you know, and a difficult one for sure. Could you maybe just elaborate about maybe on you sort of hinted towards identity. How did that affect Sharon's, you know, trying to find her identity, you know, and so on?
Well, now Sharon's gotten very active in genealogy, and I think this is just a legacy of that missing identity. She doesn't know where she came from as a person, and so trying to go back and research that with sometimes very little information. She doesn't know a lot about her biological father and where he came from, even the medical history that he had, but just where you come from as a person is very important to our identity. And so she spent a lot of time and effort into going back and trying to trace that down, and you just see that as sometimes something that takes over as a need that you have to connect to your ancestors. So,
and I think I guess one of the things that we'd hope to reiterate is that, you know, if you're in a situation maybe where you know, something similar where a grandparent is maybe raising or whatever, even the as a grandfather or grandmother or a close relative, you know, you can provide identity. You know, you can sort of influence that into the hearts and minds of people that you come in contact with, especially family members, you know, giving them a sense of identity. And I was thinking about one more thing just on that line is, in today's age where we're doing special, you know, scientific methods of creating life inside of a mother's womb, may not even be the mother, you know, where you've got some maybe it's a lesbian couple that's getting, you know, fertilized through a donor, in vitro and all that. And these children are growing up with huge identity crises because they're not being raised by anybody. Maybe sometimes that they, you know, and I know it's maybe similar in adoption, but at least in adoption there's, you know, there wasn't a lot of choices that could be made. But for two people to choose to exclude a male, you know, a father, it's causing a lot of identity. And you take that to the next step when you start talking about cloning human beings. Huge identity problems there. So, Dwayne?
Yeah, I'd like to say that from what I've seen of sometimes stepchildren, adopted children, the need for them to have that identity is given from Yahweh. We're like connected that way. It's part of who we are. It's part of who we identify ourselves as. So somehow, some way, we have to have that fulfilled. And so there's a deep need inside of, sometimes we're sort of scared of that identity because maybe that takes away from the identity that we're trying to establish now. And so that has to be dealt with, but the desire of a heart has to be satisfied to whatever level I think that they need to go to. And I say that without a lot of experience, but I also say that having seen a lot of people that have that crisis going on, and it's just a longing that they have inside. And I believe that the root of that longing is from Yahweh, so that we know who we are and we can find our way.
I'd also like to put in that if you are a member of a family that is maybe adopted or whatever, as a parent, be sure to be open to that. I don't think keeping secrets or anything like that is a good idea. You need to be aware that this is a deep-seated need that these people face, that we all face. We take it for granted knowing where we come from, knowing our parental history. And whenever you have somebody that has that disconnect, yes, they can find fulfillment in your family, and they need to find that fulfillment. But don't feel angry or threatened or anything like that for if they try to go outside and find their biological parents, because we have that need to do that also. And so be open to that, be honest about the process, and just help them through the process, and that way they don't get resentful or anything like that against you as well. So it all needs to be an open process and talk through to help each other grow.
Sort of put a cap on that. As ministers, we need to help people realize the identity that they actually find in Yahshua, and that we're all adopted into his family. And so, a lot of people may never know their biological parents, but they can find that sense of security and belonging to the family of Yahweh, and specifically to Yahshua the Messiah. So we appreciate those thoughts. I was gonna say that one of the challenging things that parents and step-parents have in common is finding their proper role in a blended family. So as we talk about what is your role in a blended family, Scott, you have some experience in that, and I just was, you've been involved with some issues inside your family. I was thinking maybe you could share those with us.
I have a little bit of a different situation. So my daughter Hannah is getting married next Sunday, which is a very good thing in our family.
Round of applause. Where's the applause? It's a marriage, folks. Come on.
And she's found a wonderful man who's done all the right things. They were here this weekend, and he's working hard. He's working like 60 hours a week, and he's bought a house, and and his house is right down the road from where we live. But for the last 10 years, there's been no. So I have a 10-year-old grandson, and so my daughter was married briefly. Had her son Caleb. Caleb never knew his real father. And in this particular situation, it's probably just as well. But what that meant is that Hannah and Caleb have lived with my wife and I ever since he was a baby. So all that he's known as a father figure in his life is me. And that has some unique challenges in itself. Little story I remember is probably maybe 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. We were at it might have been a conference, one of these conferences like this. And Caleb was out playing with a bunch of other little kids, right? And I came to check on where he was. And I walk up, and the other little kid says to Caleb, "Is this your dad?" And I knew at that point in time, Caleb had a recognition that something was different about his life. He looked at me and he said to the little kid, yes, right? And it was a moment for me too because I didn't know quite how to handle it. So I recognized that I was that father figure to him, even though he called me Papa or Grandpa. And I explained to both of them, I said, well, actually, I'm Caleb's grandfather. And we just left it at that. But what that did then in our household was made us recognize it was time to address this with Caleb. And so for the last 4 or 5 years then, it's been a steady progression of helping him understand where he came from, why it wasn't his fault that he never had a dad in his life. And so then we move forward to where we are now. So about a year and a half, maybe almost 2 years ago now, Hannah came to us and said, I've met this young man and, you know, I'd like to see more of him and I'd like your permission. And so the relationship has progressed. And last July, they got engaged. And he came to me, I don't know, maybe a couple weeks or maybe a month before that to ask permission. And he was all nervous. And I really liked it that he was nervous. And he and Caleb had been interacting for a period of time, but it was very before that time we wanted to be very careful about, you know, was this going to be someone permanently in Caleb's life or not? So so for since last July, we've worked on transitioning from me being the father figure in Caleb's life to David being the father figure in Caleb's life. And there's some unique challenges in that because, so we're a week away from the marriage, and oftentimes as David has tried to express some kind of authority in Caleb's life, he's been very resistant to that. And he'll still come to me. So I asked Caleb to do something, no problem. His soon-to-be stepdad asked him to do something, and if it's something that sounds fun and he agrees with and whatever, I mean, they're best buddies yet. But stepping into that father role is going to have some unique challenges. And so we're still working into that even as they go forward. But, you know, it's the things that we hadn't thought about as a family, and they just popped up, and we've had to deal with them as they've come. So there's two aspects that go on. Dealing with my grandson's misgivings about where he came from and why he never knew his dad, and without going into too much detail about what kind of person that man was and why he's no longer in his life. And then moving forward now into what is going to be a great thing for my daughter and my grandson, and yet it's still a transition period. So it's just another example of a blended family and things we don't often think about. And there are issues that go with that with the child then, because there's a sense we've given my grandson as much security as we can in his life. And yet there's another aspect of that too. So he has two women in his life, Grammy, who spends a considerable amount of time raising him, but then his mommy as well. And so that's been another aspect that we've had to work through and figure out who plays what role, because it was a little clearer for me that I was going to be that father figure, just the way it was. But what he would often do then, where children would play a mother and father against each other, his tact was more playing Grammy and mommy against each other. So we had to sit down as adults in the family at some point in time and say his mom was the final authority, and whatever decision she made, we would support that. You know, and it was difficult at times because, you know, we as my daughter's parents thought we had more experience and better input in it. But that's where we had to step back and say, no, that's her job. All we can do is give her the support she needs to be a successful mom and to make sure he loves her and respects her. And at the end of the day, you know, he came here with us last Thursday, but as soon as his mom showed up, I mean, that he's still, you know, Mom. When they went home last night, he's going with them. He's not sticking with Papa and Grammy. So anyway, that's our experience. And it's been a good thing for us, but it's been a challenging thing.
Well, I certainly, I speak for everybody in the room. We certainly appreciate the responsibility that you took on, and then also it sounds like a really wisdom-guided approach to that whole scenario. I can think how difficult that situation would be maybe in a different family where grandma and grandpa were happy to be the authority and left mom completely out. So as far as the role then, obviously you said grandma spends a lot of time because I suppose that Hannah's at work. So she's sort of, I would assume, taking on the nanny type role. But I was thinking, as you're transitioning from the father role and obviously handing that off, have you had any reservations about that, or have you, how did you approach that situation?
Oh, sure, plenty of reservations because I see I'm the expert with my grandson, right? And I see my son-in-law with a lot to learn yet. But that's the other thing we've done. My soon-to-be son-in-law and I have had just frank conversations with each other, both with Hannah as part of those conversations, and he and I, privately, and he'll come and ask me for advice. Just the other day, he called me at work, as a matter of fact, and said, this and this happened. He was with Caleb, and they're at his house, and I need some advice on how to handle it. And so we talked that through and worked it through, and it wasn't a big thing, but it had to do with the respect factor once again. And so we've just tried to have an open line of communication that way, realizing that for them to be a successful family, that transition is going to eventually have to be complete. And I'm just going to have to take on the grandfather role, which sounds very nice to me.
Yeah, I imagine so. Well, and that's good that, you establish that relationship with your son-in-law and he can, rely on you. I think that's important. So, is there any other, before we just move on here, do we had any comments or questions about that? Okay. Just hold on for a second here so we can get that over to you.
As the microphone's going over there, real quick, just want to share a short story. My sister had a child out of wedlock, early age. I was surprised to find out that my dad was considering abortion, which, praise Yahweh, did not happen, but he was embarrassed. Anyway, he ended up raising this child as their own. And so this child, my nephew, believes that, well, he knows he's my nephew, but he calls my dad his dad and my stepmom his mom, and that's all he knows. And he knows that, well, my mom lives in Houston, and yeah, she's got 4 or 5 kids of her own, but to him, those are his parents. And it works out. I mean, that particular is working out. So in that sense, they're happy the way it is. Like my dad loves him as a son, and my stepmom loves him as a son, and he loves them as his parents. And that role, it seems like they're comfortable in that role, and it's successful, that particular case.
Sister, do you have a comment?
Yes. You're talking about a lot with the children, but I think there's a lot between the 2 adults in the blended family. Sorry. When you're coming into the family, and I know my husband loves me, but these are his children. I have walked into his family, and kind of I can be replaced. That there's a stronger love between the children and the parent than there is between the 2 spouses. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that feels that. Like I said, I know my husband loves me. But these are his blood. And I knew this from my mother, who was married for 30 years to my stepfather. And she said, blood is thicker than water. But there's got to be some help with that bond between the couple.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think Dwayne, would like to get a word from Dwayne here because he's got some valuable insight. There are a lot of materials that we can read and things like that to help us with that. So, Dwayne, why don't you share with us what you have and maybe address that issue at the same time?
Well, one of the things that that happens when you have a blended family, obviously you all know, is that you're taking two completely foreign families in a lot of regards, and there are relationships that are going forward that are desired, such as the husband and wife getting together. But then the children are kind of in the middle of all this of crisis themselves because now they're being taken from where they would want to be, which is with their mother and their father. And so then through whatever circumstance that happens when you have the blended family come together, it begins to change all of the relationships that are involved. So you start one place and then you find out after you get into it that, okay, so then if the two adults that are married with the children on one side, they're fighting it out and they're having all these issues about who's getting control, who's getting time, who's getting all these things, then that bleeds into the new relationship where the new step parent or the person that's there, then there's this sort of hostility thing that goes on, and then all the relationships become stressed and strained, and it's really a matter of understanding priorities. And I can't really say this, I guess, with a lot of my own experience and my own saying this is the way it should work. But there's a book that I've just become familiar with, and it's called The Smart Step Family. And guys, I want to tell you, these books, sometimes these guys are right on target about giving information that will help with the transition of so many things. One of the things that they begin with, he starts in this book talking about the story of the Exodus and the way that their identity was in a crisis when they came out of Egypt, Israel. And in some ways relating that story to step families and blended families where people are coming into foreign relationships, but they're forgetting from where they came from. And so through that process, there is a way that you have to manage, navigate, and control, just like a ship in a stormy sea. It's a storm in a blended family. And I'm sure that many of you, as Cindy's talking about as well, there are just issues that then become thrust upon you that you have to start dealing with that you really weren't prepared for. And that's what I see from a lot of the children that I've been, in ministry with through time, is that they're having a struggle with the step family. The parents are having a struggle with the children, and then the corresponding relationships across the board for the previous marriage to the second marriage, they're all in some sort of crisis, and then there's this whole turmoil that goes there. So being able to navigate and control that all of those relationships and new relationships, and then areas where you didn't think you were going to, these folks have spent a lot of time analyzing that, researching, polling, talking to people who have step families. And in this book, it says basically 7 steps to a healthy family. And one of the authors that wrote this, when he had all the recommendations, one of the things that on the back is what Hector said, was that blended families can actually be a blessing if you navigate the sea well and just start putting in some boundaries, some controls, some things that will help us with that. And it's no easy matter, because when you have a child in your own house that's your own child that says, I hate you, it throws you. But yet we know through that process we still have work to do as a parent. We have to go. And then it just makes it harder when it's not your real parent for the children and the person that's hearing that. So, Cindy, I think it's for everyone out there that has a blended family, and we all are getting in an age right now where we have a lot of, if you don't have a blended family, someone in your family does have a blended family. Just like somebody said that statistic this morning, a percentage of single parents now. I mean, it's a growing segment of our society, and so there has to be some way to deal with that. And so there's actually three books that go with this. The Smart Step Family, which is the basic overview of the relationships in a step family and how they work and operate and function, and then ways that you can control and navigate those relationships. Then there's one that's specific to the Smart Step Mom, and there's one that's also related to the Smart Step Dad, and understanding how there's a process of, so let's say you're a stepdad and you're not understanding the boundaries there. Well, you can go through a process to understand that connection has to be first, that you have to make a relationship, which is really key to all things that we do as cooperation through relationship. You have to sort of establish and make a plan to get to the level where you have that respect of where you would say, okay, that's my dad. And that's I'm proud of that. And I have my mom over here that I don't live with, but this is my mom. And then helping those things to be worked together. So it's not like a perfect picture all the time, But there are steps and ways that we can use to educate ourselves to bring us to healthier relationships. And I would recommend for anyone who has a blended family, I would also recommend for those of you who are around people who have blended families, these are good educational things. I'm reading these books just so I can be educated when someone comes to me and says, hey, you know, I'm having trouble with my stepson, and I need to know how to help them with that. You know, I don't have a stepson, but I have a lot of young people around me that I sort of, you know, want to adopt into my own, and I want to make them belong to something. So, you know, making them belong and helping them feel comfortable is primary. And I think maybe just one last point. When it comes to the adults and the relationships of step families or blended families, I think we really have to understand that the children have been victimized through this whole process, and they're having such a hard time dealing with it. And I know that you guys have your issues as well, and you're having a hard time. But I think sometimes the sacrifice of being the leader, the step, or the regular parent is that we have to rise above our own pain in some ways and find out that Yahweh has the answer for us and Yahshua has the answer when we don't have the answer, but we still have to have an answer for those who are needing our protection and our guidance. So I hope that's helpful. But these books are back there, and I would recommend, again, if you have any desire, these are great. Let me read one recommendation from Dennis Rainey, who is the executive director of Family Life. He says about Ron Deal in this book, he compassionately and completely describes the spiritual and relational challenges facing step families. Ron provides practical and wise instruction for successfully navigating the step family journey. The Smart Step Family is the best book available for step families that I've seen. I'm convinced it will prove to be a valuable resource for step families. Buy it, read it, and share it with a friend. And I think that's really valuable advice for all of us who are in ministry positions as well, to be educated on how to navigate some of those relationships.
When you think about the word blended itself, think blended, right? You take a banana and you take a strawberry. You put it in the blender. He made some smoothies yesterday, right? It doesn't look the same, but yet there's bananas and strawberries in there. And I think the problem that we have with blended families today is that blended families still want to be bananas and strawberries, right? And some of us want to be coconuts, and, right? And I think that's the key. And I think what we're failing in, possibly, and I'm not accusing anyone, right? But I think what we're missing is sometimes we're missing commitment. Sometimes we go into blended families expecting that they're going to change for us instead of us changing for the commitment of the blendedness. And so I think that's one of the problems we have in marriages. What do we have in marriages? It's commitment. And so that's the key, I believe, to blended families. That's the key to knowing that you're going into a marriage where the man has 4 or 5 children and yet you don't have any. You're going to have to commit to that. Because if you don't commit to that, you're going to struggle. And I'm not saying that necessarily you're not, Cindy. I'm just saying in general, if you don't commit to it, if you're not wanting to be a blended family, and I'm realizing, I have to say this, and this is the honest truth. Some families, they don't need to be blended. They really don't. They get blended, there's going to be heck to pay, as Elder Ferris talked about yesterday, about that one man who his decisions just created chaos and caused harm in the world. Sometimes we have to look at that and say, is this the best decision for my children? Should I be blended with this person? Should I be blended with this individual? And so, the answer is no, you shouldn't. You're better off alone and taking care of your children than you are getting together with that man that Brother Scott is talking about that he wasn't even want to talk about, that gentleman that obviously caused some harm. So that's what I would say. There's a question back there, Keith.
I think Elizabeth first.
I kind of call mine a super blended family because when I was in the military, I had my son. And I came home, and my brother came home, and he basically started raising my son. Then I got married, and he had a stepfather. And my ex-husband was very abusive towards him. And when I found out, I made sure it stopped. Not in the best way, but I made sure that it stopped. And then my ex-husband, I ended up getting pregnant. Things between us started to get worse. And I'm not telling my son about his real father because of the type of person that I was dealing with at the time. It would be a very dangerous situation for all of us if that happened. So my ex-husband is the only dad that he knows. And he's actually with him right now, and he's basically, my ex-husband has accepted my son as his son and said he'll never change that. So I praise Yahweh for that. But when everything was kind of going downhill, my brother took up the father role, and he basically raised the kids. And even to this day, he's like, those are my kids, even though he's just the uncle. And now they're going more and more to my ex-husband's house, and he's about to get married to a woman who has a daughter. Yeah, it gets it gets a little more complicated. And then the way she views things and the way he views things and the way I view things are like three completely different things, because her faith is different from his faith, is different from my faith, and it's insane. And I feel like when my son especially has been greatly affected by this, because every male that was in his life left or just kind of stopped being able to be around, whether it was they left or medical conditions or circumstances. So he's never had anything consistent except for me and his sister. So I'm afraid for myself, because of all this extra blending that's happening, to get married or to even consider dating or anything like that, because I don't want to pick up the pieces any more than I already have if their hearts break. I'm afraid of that. Nothing is guaranteed in this world, in this life, because it can all be like gone in the wind, like poof, gone. And I don't want to pick up their hearts any more than I already have. So what should I do in the situation, especially if Yahweh does happen, I don't know, to bring a miracle of a man in my life, because I surely need one. But what do I do as a mother who is overprotective and has seen the pain and the shattering of my children's hearts over and over again and having to pick up the pieces? What do I do to get beyond that fear? So that way, if I do end up like remarrying, or Yahweh brings somebody into my life or into my children's lives, that I don't reject it to try and protect them. I hope that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I think one of the things that I would encourage you to do, number one, is to set out a list of characteristics of the kind of person that you're looking for. What characteristics am I looking for in a man that will treat my family with dignity and respect and lead me in the way of Yahweh? And from that standpoint, I would pray that Yahweh would open a door for a person like that to come into my life. And I think the other thing that I would recommend is what you've already said, is that you don't want to break their hearts anymore by even foolish decisions that you might make. And sometimes when we're single, in our singleness, we make decisions that do have lasting effects on those. So identifying that it is really about protecting them will protect you from getting into a relationship that will, again, bring more pain and turmoil to them. So when you set your heart after Yahweh's ways and pray specifically for a man of integrity to step into the role of fatherhood, then be patient to wait for that to happen and let Yahweh give you an answer. I think that's the best advice I could give on that.
Yeah, this actually, it's two sides of the same issue that we were having over here. On one side, you have to be very deliberate, very careful about the process of bringing another man into your life, and you really have to be deliberate in exposing your children as this happens, to make sure that they are protected throughout this process. One of the next issue is whenever you do decide to take another mate, we need to be careful that too often we've got into a culture that where marriage is disposable, and it's an automatic result of being single with children. Whenever you have a marriage that ends for whatever reason, and it may be a purposeful reason that needed to happen. If there was abuse or whatever situation where that you had to separate from that reason or from that marriage. But then you get into a situation where psychologically you've already had one marriage end, okay? And then the natural result is the next marriage has less of a solid feel to it when you've already had one marriage that you've experienced has ended. And that's something that we need to be very careful with. A marriage is intended to be for life, okay? Whenever you're experiencing this for the second time, you still need to approach that marriage. This is for life. This is a mate that you're taking. This is not a disposable mate. This is for life. Your children you're going to raise, and they're going to leave your home. That is the purpose of your children. You are raising them up to be good adults and to leave your home, while this spouse that you're bringing in to help you raise these children, you're going to be with from now on. And that's the thing that we need to make sure that we approach a new marriage as this is somebody that I'm taking not out of convenience. This is not something just because I needed help raising these kids. This is a person that I want to share my life with from this point. And part of that life that they're sharing is the raising of my kids. It is, you're bringing them in forever to go from this point on. And they're going to help you to raise your children and to raise them to be good adults. And then you're going to send your children out. But this person is going to be with you from now on. And we need to make sure that you as an adult with kids bringing in a new spouse views it like that, and then help your new spouse view it like that also, that they are not the disposable spouse. They are this is the wife that I am going to be with forever, that is going to help me to raise my children and ensure that they are a partner in the family. You know, they aren't just marrying the spouse; they're marrying into the family. These become their kids as well. This isn't my kids and your kids, and I'm raising my kids and you're raising your kids. These are two different aspects of a family coming together to raise children together, to be good adults and to send them off into the world. But the adults in that marriage, I mean, they are solidified by that act from now on, and that's the way we need to look at it.
Go ahead, wrap it up. Yeah, I was just going to say, we do have another comment out there, and it'll be the last. So we do have to wrap up this segment of our day, but we just wanted to say that we appreciate those comments, and I think prayer is necessary, so we'll be praying for you. So let's have that last comment there from
Before
Sister
she
Elise.
says hers, there was someone on the internet who wanted a clarification on what you meant by abuse.
Abuse, not sexual, physical. Spankings with a hand, a belt, stuff thrown at me, iron, no, not an iron, everything short of. But I learned how to duck pretty quick, so I was good at that. Anyway, it was physical abuse.
I just want to say that book, The Smart Step Family, I've read most of it, and it is excellent. And I highly, highly recommend it for anybody, not just if you are entering into or are in a step family, like you have a you have remarried, but if your ex-spouse or the children, or your children's father has remarried and now your children has a step-parent, even if you don't have a second marriage or whatever, it's so important for you to deal with your children so that you can address them and help them to cope with that situation, because a lot of times kids feel guilt for loving that step-parent, or they don't want to betray their parent by liking the new parent, the new step-parent. So if your children are in that situation, man up, grow up, be an adult, and act the part, because your children need you, and you have to do it right, because you want to do the best you can for them. So it's so important, and I highly recommend that book. It's excellent.
Thank you. I
The
think
Smart Step Family.
yeah, Smart Step Family.
Write the check to Dwayne Wilson.
As we wrap up, I just wanted to say that a comment on what Dwayne had mentioned there. You know, I have two step parents. I had my stepdad, Terry, and my stepmom, Dee Dee. And one of the things that they both did when they came into my life is they immediately started building a relationship with me. And so, you know, I don't ever want you to think my step situation was bad. I loved my stepdad, and we had a great time, and he invested in me. He took me to do things, and we carved wood together, and just a lot of memories that I have. And so when he came into the situation, he knew he wasn't just marrying my mom, the pretty blonde, that he was marrying this adorable blonde also that was running around. And he really made that an effort, and so did my stepmom, Dee Dee. You know, she loved me. Well, I loved her as she was a teenager. When I was a kid, I loved her, but when she got married to my dad, you know, I sort of had some issues there, but felt like I was a better man. But no, she really did care for me, and she just accepted that I was hers, and we had a successful relationship, and still do today. So that can happen, you know, but as a step parent, you know, you have to realize that it's about the relationship building first, and so it is challenging. Well, we appreciate everybody, and we want to thank these gentlemen for their experiences here that they've shared with us today. And if you have any specific questions or whatever, you can write an email to them, or you can talk to them after the session here. So we're gonna wrap up, and we just have a few more announcements, and then we're going to call it a day.